Hey friends, this is Professor Forkner. I'm just going to walk you through your week 3 assignment real quick. Your week 3 assignment is a protagonist analysis. I'm basically going to read the assignment description to you. I'll highlight a few things just so that you're clear. There's a lot of elements involved here. I strongly suggest you outline your paper so that you make sure you're hitting absolutely everything, okay? So, here we go. Protagonist analysis. Last week, you developed a spectrum analysis and beat analysis for John Patrick Shanley's Doubt, a parable. This week, we return to the play to consider the protagonist. Ha ha ha, it's tricky, tricky, tricky. All story hangs on a single peg, the protagonist. The protagonist is so central to storytelling that a lesser artist might consider the designation obvious and forego the work of analysis. What a mistake. Hopefully the readings this week dispelled that notion. Professor Harrell, who developed this course and these assignments, is referring to the fact that very often we will make a decision on who the protagonist is based on, well, who's the good guy, right? That's something that we all kind of understand on an instinctive level. We've all been raised on melodrama, whether we realize it or not. And melodrama has a tendency to make very clear distinctions about who is the protagonist. This is Luke Skywalker, and who is the antagonist? This is Darth Vader, who's wearing black. So melodrama is something that Disney movies utilize this form. We just don't realize that it's melodrama. Because we think melodrama means that the villain has a mustache, but that's not entirely true. It has more to do with clear distinctions of good versus evil. Now, but according to Aristotle, it's not quite so clear. Let's continue. If all plays were like old-fashioned melodramas, and really he's talking about the American form disparagingly referred to as melodrama, because most every movie that you love is a melodrama, even the tearjerkers and ones that aren't corny. The heroes riding in on white horses and the villains twirling their handlebar mustaches. Analyzing the protagonist and antagonist would be quite simple. Thankfully, the landscape of theater literature holds a bit more ambiguity than melodrama. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle himself stressed the importance of a complex protagonist, one who embodies both nobility and hamartia. That's a tragic flaw. He provided the term anti-hero long before the golden age of television conjured up Walter White in Breaking Bad or Tyrion in Game of Thrones. McKee's gap theory suggests that a well-written play unfolds in the gap between the subjective and objective realities of the protagonist. That is, the story unfolds in the moments that the protagonist isn't prepared for. The protagonist thinks the world is going to go one way, but then the world goes in a totally different way, and the protagonist now has to figure out how do I close this gap and get back to the world the way I think it's supposed to work. More on that in a second. The application of gap theory requires that every single plot point track back to an accurate identification and development of the protagonist. The latter is a job of directors, designers, and all actors, not just the one playing the protagonist. All artists working on a show must be on the same page about how their contributions add to a story told in the gap. All right, that's the prologue. A little wordy, huh? So let's get to the assignment. Now that that's all said, let's talk about your assignment. Your assignment kind of has two parts. Let's dive in. In an analytical essay, thank goodness, it's an essay. No more breaking down a script. All right? This is an essay. In an analytical essay, identify the protagonist of Doubt. Is Sister Aloysius the righteous protagonist standing against the nefarious Father Flynn? Or is Father Flynn the protagonist, wrongfully accused by his foil, Sister Aloysius? Or maybe could Sister James emerge as the dark horse candidate to earn the title? Make your own case. To make the case, You must show how your choice of protagonist satisfies the criteria established by both Aristotle and McKee. This doesn't mean the protagonist must align with absolutely every condition, but they must appear as the most logical match within the cast of characters. Okay? Not any character, even the Greek tragedies, fits absolutely every one of Aristotle's criteria. But we're going for the one that seems to fit the most. All right? Who is the most logical choice based on who's checking off the most boxes as opposed to who only got like 2 or 3, okay? Be advised, you are not making a subjective creative choice here. That is, I think it's it's Sister James, because I think that I want to see her grow as a character if I'm directing the play. We're not making a creative choice like that. We're making a choice based on text. You are making an analytical choice based on the text, okay? All right. So, first, if you even want to think about your essay being in 2 parts, go for it. First, consider Aristotle, all right? The Gwyn handout highlights several of the key Aristotelian requirements for a protagonist. Remember, with Aristotle, we are always making a liberal interpretation over a literal one. Remember, this is why we had to identify who your own Aristotle, because Aristotle left a lot of gaps. He gives a suggestion of, he kind of points you in a direction, but he doesn't completely fill everything in. That's why your original first week's assignment was to start filling those gaps in yourself, okay? So, for example, this is an example of what I'm talking about. Aristotle defines the protagonist as the first speaker. Now, that leaves a lot for interpretation, doesn't it? He certainly did not mean whomever has the first line in the play automatically becomes the protagonist. In a lot of Greek tragedies, it's a servant character who's delivering exposition at the beginning of a play, and they speak first. Well, that doesn't. Well, if I look at what Aristotle, maybe Aristotle means something else, because the servant character only is in that one scene, but the play is about Oedipus. It's not about the servant. So maybe what he means is that the character who speaks with the foremost voice. Maybe that's what he means by the first speaker. Not necessarily in order of appearance, but in order of importance. The Oedipus in his play is the foremost speaker. He has the foremost voice in this play. Rhetoric was very important to the Greeks. The plays have a tendency to almost play out like debates. You've got one side speaking. This is protagonist. You've got the antagonist who speaks against the protagonist. So you almost think of it like a courtroom drama. You've got the defense attorney, and then you've got the prosecutor. Okay, the protagonist, the antagonist. Okay. Aristotle goes on to suggest the protagonist must be better than the average man, but not preeminently virtuous. In what ways can a contemporary protagonist be elevated above the common man? Perhaps this is a single quality that is admirable versus requiring the protagonist to be a canonized saint. And I added the note, look no further than Oedipus. Oedipus does a lot of lousy things in his life, but there's something about him that elevates him from the common folks. Remember, the Greeks were interested in order for something to be truly tragic, you have to have something to lose, right? So that's why you've got the Greeks are dealing with stories about people in high places, because the higher you are, the farther you have to fall. The stakes are much higher because you have so much more to lose. Meanwhile, if you're poor and you don't have anything, if you lose your job, you were already poor anyway. Just find another job. No big deal. But when we're dealing with someone who is a great person in society, if they lose their position or something bad happens to them, they've got a long way to fall down that mountain. They've got a lot to lose, okay? So, which then leads to the fact that maybe the protagonist isn't someone that you really just love. Maybe you wouldn't want to necessarily be friends with Oedipus. Maybe you wouldn't really want to be friends with Hamlet. But there's something about these characters that it's more than just, is this the one that I like, right? Is this the one that I feel like I could play Nintendo Switch with? Um, Aristotle also states that any misfortune the protagonist suffers must not result from his or her own vice or depravity, so they can't be that bad. Even I take issue with this statement because one of my favorite Greek plays is Medea, and not the Tyler Perry Medea, but Medea in her play, she does a lot of things that aren't so good, but it's all stemming from the fact that she has a tragic flaw. A tragic flaw that brings misfortune their way. What is your protagonist's tragic flaw? They must have a tragic flaw. This is kind of the key thing. This is how you know who the protagonist is. If you consider, they must have one. Aristotle suggests that the flaw is typically hubris. Hubris is defined as pride or arrogance, and it's often evidenced by the protagonist's refusal to accept counsel from others. Oedipus, you don't want to know. You don't want to know this information. Stop before you find out who you're actually married to. You're not gonna like it. I don't care. I don't need to listen to you. I'm gonna do what I want. Leads to some bad things, right? So that's a common flaw. Is hubris, is pride, is this sense that and pride doesn't always mean vanity. Like I'm looking in a mirror and say I'm the best. Maybe they don't even realize that they're prideful, but they're not listening to the advice of others. They can't see past their own desire, their own nose, right? All right, let's see. Where did we leave off? If you continue reading the Poetics, you see that Aristotle's list goes on and on. Even the concepts of reversal and recognition discussed under the element of plot are demonstrated through the actions of the protagonist. These could also be relevant justifications in establishing your protagonist. All right? Additionally, Poetics suggests the protagonist must be a person of stature. We already sort of talked about that. Someone of noble birth or having importance in the community. Again, we have to fill in the gaps for Aristotle because we don't live in ancient Greece now. So we may not be dealing with kings here, but maybe someone who has an important role in society, right? The character must aim at propriety, attempting to be a good and upstanding person, even if they don't quite make it, okay? This is someone who's trying to be good or trying to do the right thing. Maybe it's a terrible thing, but they can't see that. They think they're doing the right thing. They must be true to life, a fully dimensional character the audience finds believable, okay? The character must be consistent in their actions and behaviors, operating under an established code of conduct. So, for instance, if Oedipus were to pull out a cream pie, and hit his servant with it out of the blue, that would not be consistent with his behavior, right? They must be a complex person, possibly even an anti-hero. And they're not usually a pure do-gooder. The hero, in order to be identifiable to the audience, is usually not a total saint, not an angel, right? They do some things they sin like anybody else, right? They're not like an author insert character. Um, those of you who've ever read fan fiction, you know what I'm talking about. They must demonstrate the hamartia, which is the tragic flaw, often it's hubris, that leads to their downfall, right? The story of the Titanic is a story of hubris. When the guy says, God himself could not sink this ship. Famous last words. That's an example of hubris. That's pride, and the pride goes before a fall, right? They must face a conflict in their principles, but rely on their own judgment to solve it, and eventually recognize their flawed nature and accept the consequences for their actions, which become the subject of poetic justice. Poetic justice is a concept that is really heavily used in melodrama. You understand it as the good guy gets rewarded and the bad gets punished. So if you did something wrong, you have to pay for it. Okay. We see Oedipus has to pay for it when he realizes that when he has his recognition, which leads to his reversal of fortune, we see that he's paying for what he did in the past, even though he didn't know what he was doing, right? I almost wish we were reading Oedipus because it sure is helpful in talking about Aristotle. Okay, so that's part one, right? That's a lot in part one. I'm just saying, that's a lot. If you just did part one, I'd be like, wow, good job. But guess what? There's a part two. And part one's actually is really fun. You should have a lot of fun trying to figure out who in doubt fits these characteristics. Okay. Next, so this is part two. If you want to think of this as the second half of your essay, when you're outlining it and when you're laying it out. Okay. Part two is to consider McKee. In addition to Aristotle's requirements for a protagonist, can the case be made that the gap theory is supported by your choice of protagonist? Assuming so, choose one beat or scene in the play to demonstrate. Using this section of the text, lay out a gap map for the protagonist. Professor Palladini, this is a big one. If your eyes are probably rolling in your heads right now. What is the gap theory? Professor Palladini provides a helpful example of this in his video lecture. All right, but you must use a different example from the one that he uses. Okay, the way that I like to talk about the gap is like I'll often use this illustration. It's a cold winter night. And the object of my desire is to get to that cozy cottage, my warm, cozy cottage on the other side of this frozen pond. Okay? The fastest way to get there, because I'm cold and I'm hungry and I don't want to be out in this snow on this snowy night right now. The fastest way to get to the object of my desire is to walk across the frozen pond. I fully expect, because it has been very cold, that I can walk, and I've already walked across the frozen pond already today, that when I walk across the pond, everything's going to work the way I think it will, which is the pond is going to hold my weight. However, this time, I take a step out onto the ice, and suddenly, a gap in the ice appears. Crack! Uh-oh. Well, yikes. Well, I need to take some effort if I want to keep going this direction and cross that gap to get to the other side, right? But then when I do that, I think, okay, all right, that was scary. The world didn't work the way I thought it was going to work, but I managed to overcome that obstacle. I keep walking. Well, then another gap opens, another crack in the ice, and then another, and now I have to expend even more effort to cross these cracks in the ice. And then as I do this, more and more cracks start opening up. and I have to expend even more effort and even more effort. And by this time, there's no turning back. The stakes are really high. I'm way far from the shore. I'm getting closer to the object of my desire, but it's taking more effort for me to get there. All right? The stakes are increasing. Remember rising action and how we've got these moments where the rising action often is portrayed as a zigzag line going up and up and up. So those little moments are like, uh-oh, there's a problem. Okay, I've resolved it. Oh no, there's another problem. Okay, I've resolved that. Oh no, there's another problem. And they're getting worse and worse and worse, which leads us to the climax, okay? That is the way that I start to introduce the idea of the gap theory. The world, the character thinks that the world is going to work one way, but then something happens that surprises the character. It doesn't work the way they expect. Oh no. I have to do something to solve this problem, to close the gap. But it keeps opening back up, wider and wider and wider, and it takes even more effort to close that gap, okay? It's a tricky concept, so that's why I'm introducing it to you right now, okay? So, let me see, where did I leave off? You should delineate the chosen beat or scene by citing the beginning and ending lines. You've already kind of done this, and then offer a textually supported description of the following. The protagonist's object of desire, that cozy house on the other side of the frozen pond, in the chosen beat or scene. Their first action in pursuit of the object of desire that opens the gap. I stepped out onto the ice. That's the first action that I took in pursuit of that object of desire that caused the ice to crack. Examples of inner conflict, personal conflict, and extrapersonal conflict that result in the gap. When the gap opens, all of a sudden I'm faced with my own mortality. All of a sudden I think it's not only is it getting harder for me to get there, but now I have to start judging, is this okay? Should I continue? Is this a dumb idea? Are my friends going to laugh at me when they find out that I was walking across a frozen pond in the middle of the night alone? These are all different things, okay? But these are all the things that happen when a problem arises in a play. A brief description of what is at risk for the protagonist. I could fall into the water and freeze to death. And then a second action resulting from the initial gap that suggests a continuation of the pattern. I take another action, I took that step out, and I decide to leap forward as opposed to just step forward, okay? So that's my second action that I take, okay? I like to break it down that way because I think it makes sense that way, but it plays out so differently in stories. So, because we're not always crossing frozen ponds, right? If you take a fairy tale or a story, for instance, like The Wizard of Oz, or I always love to go back to Cinderella or The Three Pigs, that can kind of help you if you break it down that way. In your considerations of both Aristotle and McKee, please remember, this is a textual analysis. Using the script in support of your position is key, okay? Please do not simply state opinions without citing evidence from the script. This doesn't mean direct quotes of dialogue are necessary for every point you make, but they should be prevalent in your paper, okay? Stage directions are also useful textual evidence. Your essay this week should be 500 to 750 words. Clear, well-supported arguments can be quite succinct. The goal here is quality over quantity. So if this is a 24-page paper, don't make a 24-page paper. Just make sure you've thought this through, if you've outlined it, and you just hit these points nice and clear, all right? Your paper should always conform to the MLA style manual as relevant. However, for the purpose of this specific assignment, you do not need to use citations when referencing the dialogue from the play, because you're pretty much, we're going to give you a little bit of a break here. Your paper must be submitted through Blackboard by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night. No late work will be accepted. All right. I hope this was helpful. I think that you can see, aside from wrapping your head around the gap theory, you see that this is a much more straightforward assignment than last week's assignment was. So, If you have any other questions, please let me know. But again, everything that I just read to you is in the assignment description. I hope that by going through it with you, that this helped to illuminate some things, and that it answered some of your questions maybe preemptively. So take another look at the description if you have questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing your papers. Thank you, everybody.